The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence's house as Camilla Parker Bowles sat in the drawing room, her hands trembling slightly as she held the morning newspaper. The headlines screamed what she had been dreading for months. The public was calling for answers, and the royal family was under more pressure than ever before. Charles had left early that morning for an emergency meeting with his advisors. The weight of recent events had aged him visibly, and Camilla could see the strain in every line of his face. Their marriage, once a source of joy after years of waiting, now felt like a burden they both carried in silence. The scandal had erupted 3 weeks ago when a former palace employee came forward with documents that painted Camilla in an unflattering light. The papers suggested she had used her influence inappropriately, making decisions that affected royal protocol without proper authority. While the accusations weren't criminal, they struck at the heart of what the British public expected from their royal family. Camilla's phone buzzed constantly with calls from her private secretary, each message more urgent than the last. The palace press office was struggling to contain the damage, and even her closest friends seemed to be keeping their distance. She felt isolated in a way she hadn't experienced since the difficult years before her marriage to Charles. The irony wasn't lost on her. After decades of being the other woman, fighting for acceptance and finally achieving her place beside the future king, she now found herself facing the possibility of losing everything. The public that had slowly warmed to her was turning cold again, and this time, the criticism felt more personal and more damaging. As she walked through the house that had become her sanctuary, Camilla couldn't help but notice how empty it felt. The staff moved quietly, avoiding eye contact, and the usual warmth that filled these rooms seemed to have evaporated. Even her beloved dog sensed the tension, staying close to her side as if offering comfort. The situation had become so serious that palace lawyers were now involved, reviewing every aspect of her role and responsibilities. Each day brought new revelations in the press, and Camilla found herself reliving mistakes she thought were buried in the past. The media had a way of connecting dots that didn't necessarily belong together, creating a narrative that felt foreign to her own understanding of events. Her stepchildren, William and Harry, had maintained a careful distance throughout the crisis. While they had never been particularly close to her, their silence now felt more pronounced. She understood their position was delicate, but their absence stung nonetheless. These were the same young men she had tried to support and guide through their own difficult moments. Charles tried to shield her from the worst of it, but Camilla could see the toll the situation was taking on him as well. His loyalty to her was unwavering, but she knew he was being pulled in different directions by his advisors, his family, and his duty to the crown. The pressure was enormous, and she feared what it might cost them both. The breaking point came when Charles received a call from his eldest son. William's voice was calm but firm as he explained that the situation could no longer be ignored. The monarchy's reputation was at stake, and difficult decisions needed to be made. Charles listened in silence, his face growing paler with each passing moment. That evening, as they sat together in their private sitting room, Charles finally spoke the words Camilla had been dreading. The palace had decided that she needed to step back from her public duties while the investigation continued. It wasn't a formal suspension, but it might as well have been. Her diary was being cleared, her patronages were being quietly reassigned, and her public appearances were being canceled indefinitely. Camilla felt the walls of her carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. Everything she had worked for, every relationship she had built, every bridge she had carefully repaired seemed to be collapsing around her. The woman who had once been confident in her place in the royal family now felt like an outsider once again, watching her future slip away with each passing day. The summons came on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a palace courier whose face revealed nothing. William wanted to see her at Kensington Palace that afternoon. No explanation was given, but Camilla knew this wasn't a social visit. Her stomach knotted as she read the formal invitation, understanding that this meeting would likely determine her future within the royal family. Charles was away on official duties in Scotland, leaving Camilla to face this encounter alone. She had asked him to postpone the trip, sensing that something significant was about to happen, but his schedule couldn't be changed. Now she wondered if his absence was intentional, a way for the family to handle the situation without putting him in an impossible position between his wife and his son. As her car pulled through the gates of Kensington Palace, Camilla couldn't help but remember happier times when she had visited William and Catherine here. Those days seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by the cold formality that had settled over all her royal relationships. The palace staff who greeted her were polite but distant, their usual warmth replaced by professional courtesy. William was waiting in his private study, dressed in a dark suit that made him look older than his years. His posture was rigid, and his blue eyes held a coldness that Camilla had never seen directed at her before. He gestured for her to sit in the chair across from his desk, creating a physical barrier between them that felt symbolic of the growing distance in their relationship. The conversation began with pleasantries about Catherine and the children, but Camilla could sense William's impatience with small talk. He had inherited his grandmother's ability to maintain perfect composure while delivering difficult news, and she braced herself for what was coming. The weight of his future crown seemed to rest heavily on his shoulders as he prepared to speak. When William finally addressed the situation directly, his words were measured and careful. He spoke about the monarchy's reputation, about public trust, and about the responsibility they all shared to protect the institution. His tone was clinical, as if he were discussing a business matter rather than the future of his stepmother. Camilla felt herself becoming smaller in her chair with each carefully chosen word. The accusations against her were serious enough to warrant a formal investigation, William explained. While he couldn't discuss the details, he made it clear that the evidence was compelling. The palace had tried to handle the matter quietly, but the situation had spiraled beyond their control. Public opinion was turning against the entire family, and something had to be done to restore confidence. Camilla tried to defend herself, explaining her side of the story and the context behind the decisions that were now being questioned. But William's expression remained unchanged, his face a mask of royal duty. He listened politely but offered no words of comfort or understanding. The young man who had once awkwardly accepted her into the family was gone, replaced by a future king who saw her as a liability. The most painful moment came when William spoke about the impact on his father. Charles was being pulled in too many directions, trying to support his wife while also protecting the crown. The stress was visible, and William worried about the long-term effects on his father's health and effectiveness as a leader. His words carried an implicit message that Camilla's presence was causing harm to the man they both claimed to love. As the meeting continued, Camilla realized that this wasn't a discussion or negotiation. William had already made up his mind about what needed to happen. His calm demeanor couldn't hide the steel beneath, the same determination that had made his grandmother such an effective monarch. He spoke with the authority of someone who knew his decisions would be final. The room felt smaller as William outlined what he called a temporary solution. Camilla would need to step away from public life completely, not just from her official duties. No appearances, no statements, no public presence whatsoever, until the investigation was complete and the situation could be properly resolved. The message was clear. She was being banished from the only life she had known for years. Camilla's voice cracked as she tried to respond, but William had already moved on to discussing logistics. Her security detail would be reduced, her official residence might need to be reconsidered, and her staff would be reassigned. He spoke about these life-altering changes as if they were minor administrative details, his emotional distance making each word feel like a physical blow. The meeting was drawing to a close, and Camilla could sense that her time was running out. This might be her last chance to reach the man behind the royal title, to remind him of the relationship they had built over the years. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw only the cold resolve of duty, and she knew that whatever connection they had once shared was now buried beneath the weight of the crown. The silence in the room became unbearable as William finished outlining his decisions. Camilla felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack under the weight of what she was hearing. This wasn't just about stepping back from duties anymore. This was about erasing her from royal life entirely. The magnitude of what was happening hit her like a physical force, and she struggled to find her voice. When she finally spoke, her words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other as she tried to make William understand what this meant to her. She spoke about the years she had spent earning her place in the family, the careful relationships she had built, the causes she had championed. Her voice grew more desperate as she realized that her pleas were falling on deaf ears. but she couldn't stop herself from trying. Camilla reminded William of the times she had supported him through difficult periods, the advice she had offered when he struggled with his royal duties, the way she had tried to be a bridge between him and his father during their occasional disagreements. She spoke about Christmas mornings at Sandringham, family celebrations where she had slowly become part of the fabric of their lives. These memories felt precious now, like treasures that were being taken away from her. The desperation in her voice became more apparent as she spoke about Charles and their marriage. She explained how much they meant to each other, how they had waited so long to be together, how their relationship had brought stability and happiness to both their lives. The thought of losing not just her public role, but potentially her place in the family was devastating, and her words became increasingly emotional. William remained unmoved by her emotional appeal, his training in royal duty evident in every line of his body. He had learned early that personal feelings could not be allowed to interfere with decisions that affected the monarchy. His grandmother had taught him that the crown required sacrifices, and sometimes those sacrifices had to be made by the people closest to you. This was one of those moments. As Camilla continued to plead her case, she began to reveal more about the accusations against her. She tried to explain the context behind each decision, the pressures she had faced, the impossible position she had often found herself in as someone who was part of the family, but not born to it. Her explanation sounded weak even to her own ears, and she could see that they were having no impact on William's resolve. The conversation took a more personal turn when Camilla spoke about the loneliness she had endured over the years. She talked about the constant scrutiny, the way every gesture was analyzed and criticized, the weight of knowing that one mistake could destroy everything she had worked to build. Her voice broke as she described the isolation she felt, surrounded by protocol and duty but starved of genuine human connection. William's response was measured and cold. He acknowledged her feelings but pointed out that everyone in the royal family faced similar pressures and expectations. The difference was that when others made mistakes, they found ways to learn from them and move forward. In her case, the pattern of poor judgment had continued, and the consequences could no longer be ignored or minimized. The most heartbreaking moment came when Camilla spoke about her stepchildren and how much their acceptance had meant to her. She had never tried to replace their mother, she explained, but she had hoped to earn their respect and perhaps even their affection. The thought of losing that connection, of being cut off from William and Harry completely, brought tears to her eyes that she could no longer hide. But William's expression didn't soften. If anything, his mention of his mother seemed to strengthen his resolve. He spoke briefly about duty and loyalty, about protecting the institution that his mother had served so faithfully. His words carried an implicit comparison that stung Camilla deeply, suggesting that she had failed to live up to the standards that Diana had set. As the conversation continued, Camilla's pleas became more desperate. She offered to make amends, to publicly apologize, to do whatever was necessary to repair the damage. She spoke about seeking professional help, about changing her approach to royal duties, about learning from her mistakes. But with each suggestion, William's responses became shorter and more final. The power dynamic in the room was unmistakable. William sat behind his desk like a judge delivering a sentence, while Camilla found herself leaning forward in her chair, her body language reflecting her increasingly desperate position. She was no longer the confident woman who had married into the royal family. She was someone fighting for her survival within it. Finally, Camilla's composure broke completely. Tears streamed down her face as she begged William to reconsider, to give her another chance to remember the good times they had shared as a family. Her voice became a whisper as she spoke about how much the royal family meant to her, how losing her place in it would destroy everything she had worked for. But even as she spoke, she could see in William's eyes that her words were having no effect whatsoever. William's response to Camilla's emotional breakdown was swift and clinical. He reached across his desk and offered her a box of tissues, his gesture polite but devoid of any real warmth or sympathy. The contrast between her raw emotion and his controlled composure was stark, highlighting the gulf that had opened between them. His training in royal protocol had prepared him for moments like this, where personal feelings had to be set aside for the greater good. As Camilla wiped her tears and tried to regain some dignity, William continued speaking in the same measured tone he had maintained throughout their meeting. He explained that her emotional state only reinforced his concerns about her judgment and stability. A member of the royal family, he pointed out, needed to maintain composure under pressure, and her current behavior suggested she was not equipped to handle the scrutiny that came with royal duties. The criticism cut deep because Camilla knew there was truth in his words. She had always prided herself on her ability to handle difficult situations with grace, but the accumulated stress of recent weeks had worn down her defenses. Now her moment of vulnerability was being used as evidence against her. Proof that she was unsuitable for the role she had fought so hard to claim. William spoke about the need for consistency and reliability in royal behavior. He cited examples of how other family members had handled crisis situations, maintaining their dignity even under the most intense pressure. His grandmother, in particular, had set a standard for grace under fire that had served the monarchy well for decades. The implication was clear. Camilla had failed to meet that standard. The conversation shifted to practical matters as William outlined the timeline for her withdrawal from public life. He had already spoken with the palace press office about managing the announcement, and a statement would be released within days. The official line would be that she was taking time to focus on personal matters, but everyone would understand the real meaning behind the carefully chosen words. Camilla tried once more to appeal to their personal relationship, reminding William of the bond they had shared over the years. She spoke about family dinners where they had laughed together, about conversations where he had sought her advice, about moments when she had felt genuinely accepted as part of the family. But her words seemed to bounce off him like rain against a window, leaving no impression whatsoever. William's response was perhaps the most hurtful thing he could have said. He acknowledged that there had been pleasant moments between them, but he made it clear that those interactions had been driven by politeness and duty, rather than genuine affection. He had accepted her presence because his father loved her, but that acceptance had always been conditional on her behavior bringing credit to the family. The betrayal Camilla felt was overwhelming. She had genuinely believed that her relationships within the royal family were built on more than mere tolerance. To learn that William had never truly accepted her, that every smile and conversation had been an act of duty rather than genuine warmth, was devastating. It meant that her entire understanding of her place in the family had been an illusion. As William continued to speak, his words became increasingly formal and distant. He spoke about her as if she were a problem to be solved rather than a person who was suffering. His language was careful and precise, chosen to minimize any legal liability while making his position absolutely clear. She was no longer family to him. She was a threat to be neutralized. The meeting was clearly coming to an end, and William began gathering the papers on his desk in a gesture that suggested their time was up. He informed Camilla that security would escort her out of the palace and that future communications should go through official channels. The personal access she had enjoyed as a family member was being revoked immediately, and she would need to make appointments like any other member of the public. Camilla made one final attempt to reach him, speaking directly about Charles and how this decision would affect their marriage. She explained that forcing her to choose between her husband and her role in the royal family was cruel and unnecessary. But William's response was immediate and final. The choice had already been made for her, and she would have to live with the consequences. The coldness in William's voice as he delivered this final blow was shocking. This was not the awkward young man who had struggled to accept his father's new relationship. This was a future king making a calculated decision to protect his inheritance. The transformation was complete, and Camilla realized that the person she thought she knew had perhaps never existed at all. As she prepared to leave, William stood and walked around his desk, but not to offer comfort or a final moment of connection. Instead, he moved to the door, his body language making it clear that he was eager for her to go. The gesture was subtle but unmistakable, and it completed Camilla's humiliation. She was being dismissed not just from her role, but from his presence like a servant who had overstayed their welcome. The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla realized that nothing she could say would change his mind, and any further pleading would only diminish her dignity further. The man standing before her was no longer someone she could reach with appeals to emotion or family loyalty. He had made his decision with the cold calculation that would one day make him an effective king, but which now made him seem like a stranger. The moment William moved toward the door, Camilla felt a surge of panic that threatened to overwhelm her completely. This couldn't be how it ended. Not after everything they had been through as a family. She rose from her chair with unsteady legs, her hands shaking as she realized that her last chance to change his mind was slipping away. The finality of his body language terrified her more than anything else that had happened during their meeting. In a voice that was barely above a whisper, Camilla called his name. William paused with his hand on the door handle, but he didn't turn around immediately. When he finally faced her again, his expression was one of barely concealed impatience. He had clearly considered their conversation finished, and her attempt to prolong it only seemed to irritate him further. The coldness in his eyes was more pronounced now, as if he was looking at a stranger rather than someone who had been part of his family for years. Camilla's final plea was raw and desperate, stripped of all pretense and protocol. She begged him to remember that she was still his father's wife, that destroying her would inevitably hurt Charles as well. She spoke about the damage this would do to family relationships, about how it would create divisions that might never heal. Her words tumbled out in a rush, each one more desperate than the last as she tried to make him understand the human cost of his decision. But William's response was swift and devastating. He told her that he had already considered the impact on his father, and had concluded that short-term pain was preferable to long-term damage to the monarchy. Charles would understand, he said, because duty had to come before personal feelings. The crown required sacrifices from everyone, and this was one that had to be made. His words were delivered with a certainty that left no room for argument or appeal. This conversation took on an even more personal tone when Camilla mentioned the promises Charles had made to her about their future together. She spoke about the plans they had discussed, the role she was supposed to play when he became king, the life they had envisioned building together. But William cut her off with a gesture that was both dismissive and final. Those promises, he explained, had been made before the current situation arose, and circumstances had now changed beyond recognition. William's next words were perhaps the cruelest of all. He suggested that if Camilla truly loved his father, she would remove herself from the situation voluntarily, rather than forcing the family to take action against her. A graceful exit, he said, would cause less damage to everyone involved, including herself. The implication was clear. She could leave with some dignity and tact, or she could be forcibly removed with none at all. The manipulation in his words was obvious, but it was effective nonetheless. By framing her removal as an act of love for Charles, William was trying to make her complicit in her own destruction. It was a masterful piece of psychological pressure, designed to make her feel that resistance would only prove her selfishness. The technique was worthy of the most skilled political operatives, and it showed just how much William had learned about wielding power. Camilla's response was immediate and emotional. She refused to accept his characterization of the situation, pointing out that he was asking her to destroy her own life, to make his easier. She spoke about the unfairness of being punished for mistakes that others had made as well, about the double standards that seemed to apply only to her. Her voice grew stronger as anger began to replace desperation, and for a moment it seemed as though she might find the strength to fight back. But William was unmoved by her show of defiance. He pointed out that fairness was a luxury the royal family couldn't afford, and that sometimes individuals had to be sacrificed for the greater good. His tone suggested that he viewed her resistance as childish and naive, as if she was failing to understand the basic realities of royal life. The condescension in his voice was unmistakable, and it served to diminish her even further. The final exchange between them was brief, but devastating. Camilla made one last attempt to appeal to any remaining shred of humanity in William, speaking about her fears for the future, and her uncertainty about what would happen to her. She asked him to at least show some compassion for her situation, even if he couldn't change his mind about the outcome. But his response was clinical and detached, offering only the observation that she should have considered these consequences before making the choices that led to this moment. As William opened the door and gestured for her to leave, Camilla realized that her worst fears were being realized. She wasn't just losing her role or her public position, she was being erased from the family entirely. The man who was showing her out wasn't someone who had ever cared about her as a person, and she wondered if anyone in the royal family ever really had. The thought was devastating, but it also brought a strange kind of clarity. The walk to the door felt like the longest journey of Camilla's life. Each step took her further away from the life she had known and closer to an uncertain future. William walked beside her, but the distance between them felt immeasurable. He had made his decision with the cold efficiency of a surgeon removing a tumor, and nothing in his demeanor suggested that he felt any regret about what he was doing. At the threshold, Camilla turned for one final look at the man who was destroying her life. She searched his face for any sign of doubt or compassion, any indication that he might reconsider his position, but William's expression remained unchanged, his blue eyes as cold and distant as they had been throughout their entire encounter. He was already looking past her, his mind clearly focused on the next item on his agenda, as if she had already ceased to exist in his world. The sound of the door closing behind Camilla echoed through the corridor like a gunshot, final and irreversible. She stood alone in the hallway, struggling to process what had just happened. The ornate surroundings of Kensington Palace, once familiar and welcoming, now felt hostile and foreign. Every portrait on the wall seemed to stare down at her with judgment. Every piece of furniture a reminder of the world from which she was now excluded. Her legs felt unsteady as she began the long walk toward the palace entrance. The corridor stretched ahead of her like a tunnel, each step taking her further from her old life and closer to an uncertain future. The sound of her heels on the marble floor seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, marking time like a countdown to her exile. She tried to maintain some dignity in her posture, but the weight of defeat made every movement feel labored and painful. Palace staff appeared at various points along her route, their faces carefully neutral as they went about their duties. Some had worked with her for years, had shared conversations and moments of genuine warmth, but now they avoided eye contact entirely. The message was clear. Word had already spread about her status, and she was no longer someone they could afford to acknowledge. The speed with which the palace machinery had moved to erase her was both impressive and terrifying. As she passed through rooms that held memories of happier times, Camilla felt the full weight of what she was losing. Here was the drawing room where she had celebrated her first successful royal engagement. There was the terrace, where she had shared quiet conversations with other family members. Each space held echoes of laughter and connection that now felt like cruel mockeries of her current situation. The palace that had once represented acceptance now felt like a mausoleum of dead dreams. Her phone buzzed constantly in her handbag, but she couldn't bring herself to answer it. Charles would be trying to reach her, worried about the meeting and eager to hear what had happened. How could she tell him that his son had just systematically destroyed their life together? How could she explain that the family he loved so much had decided she was expendable? The thought of that conversation filled her with dread. The security escort that William had mentioned materialized as she approached the main entrance. 2 officers in plain clothes flanked her path, their presence subtle but unmistakable. They weren't there to protect her anymore. They were there to ensure she left quietly and didn't cause any embarrassment to the family. The transition from protected family member to potential security risk had happened so quickly that it left her feeling disoriented and vulnerable. Outside, the autumn afternoon felt harsh and unwelcoming. The sky was gray and threatening rain, matching her mood perfectly. Her car waited in the courtyard, looking small and insignificant against the backdrop of the massive palace. The driver's face was professionally blank as he held the door open for her, but she caught a flicker of sympathy in his eyes that almost undid her completely. Even the staff could see how far she had fallen. As the car pulled away from Kensington Palace, Camilla allowed herself one look back at the building that had just become the site of her downfall. The windows reflected the gray sky like dead eyes, giving no hint of the life and activity within. Somewhere behind those walls, William was probably already moving on to his next appointment. The destruction of her life, just another item checked off his daily agenda. The casual efficiency with which he had handled her devastation was perhaps the most hurtling thing of all. The drive back to Clarence House passed in a blur of London traffic and gray buildings. Camilla stared out the window without really seeing anything, her mind replaying every moment of the disastrous meeting. She searched for signs she might have missed, words she could have said differently, appeals that might have worked better. But deep down, she knew that nothing would have changed the outcome. William had made his decision before she even arrived. The photographers outside Clarence House confirmed that news of her situation was already beginning to leak. They pressed against the car windows as it passed through the gates, their cameras clicking frantically as they tried to capture her expression. Camilla kept her face turned away, but she knew that by tomorrow images of her retreat would be splashed across every newspaper in the country. The narrative was already being written, and she had no control over how the story would be told. Inside her home, the silence was deafening. The staff had withdrawn to give her privacy, but their absence only emphasized how alone she had become. Even in her own house, she felt like a guest who had overstayed their welcome. The beautiful rooms that had once been her sanctuary now felt like a prison, and she wondered how long she would be allowed to remain even here. Charles's portrait smiled down at her from the mantelpiece, captured in happier times when their future had seemed secure. Looking at his face now, Camilla felt a crushing sense of guilt about what her situation would do to him. He had fought so hard for their acceptance, had sacrificed so much to make their relationship work, and now it was all crumbling because of her failures. The thought that she might have to choose between him and his family was unbearable. The phone rang insistently, but Camilla couldn't bring herself to answer it. She knew it would be Charles, calling from Scotland with concern and love in his voice, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. How could she tell him that his son had just walked away from her pleas without a second thought? How could she explain that the family unity he treasured was built on foundations far more fragile than any of them had realized? As evening approached, Camilla remained sitting in her drawing room, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that was already beginning to feel like history. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but for now, she simply sat in the growing darkness, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly. The woman who had once believed she could overcome any obstacle now faced the possibility that some bridges once burned could never be rebuilt. 3 days passed before Charles returned from Scotland, 3 days during which Camilla lived in a state of suspended animation. She moved through her daily routines like a ghost, unable to eat, unable to sleep properly, unable to focus on anything except the impossible conversation she would soon have to have with her husband. The palace had maintained its silence, but she knew that the official announcement of her withdrawal was imminent. When Charles finally walked through the door of Clarence House, his face immediately revealed that he had heard something during his journey home. The usual warmth in his eyes was replaced by confusion and concern, and Camilla could see that he was trying to piece together fragments of information that didn't quite make sense. His first words to her were gentle but probing, asking about her meeting with William and why she seemed so distressed. The conversation that followed was the most difficult of Camilla's life. She tried to find gentle ways to explain what had happened, but there was no softening the brutal reality of William's ultimatum. As she spoke, she watched her husband's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally a deep sadness that seemed to age him before her eyes. The man who had fought so hard to bring them together was learning that his family had torn them apart. Charles's initial response was to deny that William could have been so cold and calculating. He insisted that there must have been a misunderstanding, that his son would never deliberately hurt someone he cared about. But as Camilla recounted the conversation in detail, repeating William's exact words and describing his demeanor, Charles's protests grew weaker. The evidence was overwhelming, and even his paternal loyalty couldn't explain away what had happened. The most heartbreaking moment came when Charles realized the position his son had put him in. William had forced him to choose between his wife and his family, between personal happiness and royal duty. The choice was impossible, and Charles seemed to physically shrink as he understood the magnitude of what was being asked of him. His voice cracked as he spoke about the unfairness of the situation and his anger at being manipulated by his own child. But even as Charles raged against William's actions, Camilla could see doubt creeping into his eyes. The accusations against her were serious, and while he didn't believe she was guilty of deliberate wrongdoing, he couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility that she had made serious errors in judgment. The trust between them, once absolute, now had hairline cracks that threatened to spread if pressure continued to be applied. The official announcement came 2 days later, carefully worded to suggest that Camilla's withdrawal was voluntary and temporary. The palace statement spoke of her desire to focus on personal matters and spend time with family, making no mention of investigations or forced exile. But the media immediately began reading between the lines, and speculation about the real reasons for her retreat dominated the news cycle for weeks. Charles tried to maintain his support for his wife publicly, but privately the strain was beginning to show. The pressure from his advisors was immense, and even some of his closest friends suggested that perhaps William's harsh medicine was exactly what the situation required. The isolation that had once brought Charles and Camilla closer together was now driving a wedge between them. As each dealt with the crisis in their own way, the investigation into Camilla's conduct continued behind closed doors, led by palace lawyers who left no stone unturned in their examination of her activities. While no criminal wrongdoing was discovered, the report painted a picture of someone who had overstepped her authority on multiple occasions and had shown poor judgment in her interactions with various institutions. The document was never made public, but its conclusions provided William with the justification he needed for his actions. As weeks turned into months, Camilla found herself living in a strange limbo. She was still married to the future king, but she was no longer part of royal life in any meaningful way. Invitations stopped coming. Patronages were quietly transferred to other family members, and her name began to disappear from official documents and websites. The erasure was systematic and thorough, as if the palace was preparing for a future in which she had never existed. The relationship between Charles and William remained strained, with formal communications replacing the easy affection that had once characterized their bond. Charles struggled to forgive his son for the way he had treated Camilla, while William remained convinced that he had made the only decision possible under the circumstances. Family gatherings became tense affairs, with careful choreography required to avoid uncomfortable confrontations. For Camilla, the months that followed were a period of profound reflection and gradual acceptance. She began to understand that her place in the royal family had always been more precarious than she had realized, built on tolerance rather than genuine acceptance. The scandal had simply provided William with the excuse he needed to address what he saw as a long-standing problem. In a way, his honesty was almost refreshing after years of polite pretense. The final irony came when public opinion began to shift slightly in Camilla's favor. Some commentators criticized the palace's handling of the situation, suggesting that she had been made a scapegoat for problems that went far beyond her individual actions. But by then, the damage was done, and there was no path back to her former position. William had succeeded in removing what he saw as a threat to the monarchy, but the cost had been higher than anyone had anticipated. Years later, when historians looked back at this period, they would debate whether William's actions had been necessary or excessive. But for Camilla, the academic discussions mattered little. She had learned the hardest lesson of all, that in the world of royalty, personal relationships were always secondary to institutional needs, and mercy was a luxury that future kings could rarely afford to show.